I'm Tom Stridicus. I'm the Dean of the College of Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Distinguished Lecture Series on Quality Teaching and Learning in Early Childhood. Let's think about that title for a moment, Quality Teaching and Learning, and think about where we are in this current epoch in the history of Washington State and where we are in terms of educational improvement. If we were to turn our heads to the south and draw an imaginary line between I-90 and start a circle that went through Kent, Renton, down through Tukwila, around Auburn, through the lowlands of Bellevue, and back up through South Seattle, essentially South King County. And we had a room full of kindergarten kids with us, vibrant and excited to do all the work they're going to do. We'd realize that in South King County, only 2 of 10 of those children will graduate from a 2- or a 4-year university. If we focus our lens more clearly on students of color in that same population in South King County, just a little bit away from us, we'd realize that only 1 in 10 of those children will persist to a 2- or 4-year degree. That's absolutely unconscionable, and for a region as rich and intellectually prosperous as ours, it is something we actually have to put a stake in the ground and do battle with. And in the College of Education, we see our work, both through our research and our engagement with partners in the region, as squarely focused on attacking the achievement gap. And there is perhaps no area where we can make greater headway than the area of early childhood education. And it is such a pleasure to work with Professor Susan Sandal and her colleague Gail Joseph, and the work that they've started around the National Center for Teaching and Learning, and particularly in Washington State. We talk a lot about Washington State and where it is in relationship to ed reform, but around early learning, I think Washington State has clearly established itself as a leader, and this lecture series is an example of that. So I will turn it over to Professor Susan Sandal, who's the director of the National Center for NCTQL. You guys have so many acronyms, but who will introduce our speaker tonight, and thank you for coming.
Thanks.
You bet.
Good evening. I am Susan Sandal, and I'm the co-director of the National Center on Quality Teaching and Learning. And to start us off, I have a very important announcement. You know what it is. Please turn off your cell phones. We are delighted tonight to welcome Dr. Laura Justice as our kickoff speaker for this lecture series. And I'd like to tell you just a little bit about Laura and her work. She is a professor in the School of Teaching and Learning at The Ohio State University. Her research interests focus on young children with developmental vulnerabilities in language and literacy. Her work examines the effects of teacher and parent interventions on children's learning. And I think it's important to note that Laura is in a college of education. She's on faculty in a college of education. And she is a speech-language pathologist. So she approaches this work from those kind of dual perspectives, and I think that you'll hear that that informs her work. She is a prolific writer and researcher. She has a long list of publications, including, I believe, at least 4 books and many research publications. Her work is supported by funding from ASHA, from NIH, from IES, and that just gives you a flavor of how well regarded her work is and the importance of what she's doing. Tonight, as you see, her topic is Promoting Young Children's Knowledge and Print, Designing Systematic Early Literacy Environments. And please help me welcome Laura Justice. We're delighted that she's here.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming out. Usually by about 7 p.m., I'm kicking back for a night of CNN. That's my life. And actually, I should warn you, it's 10 o'clock in Ohio, so we're butting up against my bedtime here. I'm going to try really hard to be coherent. Let me start by saying thank you for bringing me out here. Doing these kind of things, bringing people in, is always a lot harder work than it appears. And so you have a lot of folks to thank in terms of making all this happen. And you are going to have an amazing lecture series. The folks that they're bringing in with the exception of tonight, are really extraordinary leaders in the field, and you are so lucky to be participating in this. So as you can tell from the title, I'm going to talk about young children, early literacy development, which I'm going to refer to as knowledge about print. I'll dig into that a little bit more deeply, and how to design early literacy interventions that enhance the early skills of young children who need those early boosts for various reasons. I like to point out that when we talk about early literacy in young children, it's nothing to get squeamish about, and some people do. Talking about young children as readers and writers is a fairly new topic. It's probably only about 10 or 15 years that this began to be somewhat common parlance to discuss young children as being on a pathway to reading and writing. And when I talk about young children's skills, I'm talking about things like this. This came, I cut and pasted it out of an article in Reading Research Quarterly. It was an example of a 2-year-old's writing of his name. When I talk about early reading and writing in young children, I'm talking about things like that. I'm also talking about things like this. That's my little boy. And he has contributed a lot to my thinking on this topic, as well as my older child. But here he is at 4, and you can see that he had written some letters behind his name. Early alphabet knowledge is one of the best predictors of future decoding skill. That's been very strongly documented in a number of papers. This is actually only about 2 weeks ago, my husband texted me, and he said, Griffin wrote his name in cursive, and that's what you see. And it's like fake cursive. There's nothing, I mean, he's like, his name is Griffin, Griffin, and you can see he's just writing the capital letters and drawing lines between them. And so that's an example of an early reading and writing behavior, and as cute as these things are, they are fundamentally important. And I'm going to share with you some of the research that shows us that as cute as these things are, they're also very developmentally significant. This is one of my favorites for 2 reasons. This is on a whiteboard in our kitchen, and this is about 6 months ago. So he was just short of his 5th birthday. And Griffin was writing the word hello under the model. My dad. Oh my God, it's like multiple weird Freudian slips. My husband had written, and this is being recorded, but my husband had written the word hello, and Griffin was modeling it, and this is cute because we all teased him about writing this bad word. And he's like, no, it says hell, and there's the O, and he wrote this little O. And the reason this is so exciting from a developmental perspective is it shows you that he, as sophisticated as this looks, he's got his letters, he's writing, he's encoding, he's decoding, but he doesn't yet know what a word is. And so for him, a word is not yet squarely on a single line with the invariant parentheses around what a word is. And that usually comes sometime after the 5th birthday. And people call that a watershed event in the life of reading development for kids, because once they realize what a word is, then they start to really study inside a word and learn all of the interesting orthography beholden to the English language. So that's a great example. This is another example of a very important early literacy achievement. The child's first production in writing of their own name. Children tend to learn their first initial before any other letter, about 11 times more likely to learn their first letter as their first initial as their first letter, and then they start to learn the additional letters in their name as well. I always tell people, name your kids a long name because it gives them an edge. That's not proven, but I will prove it. There is glimpses of evidence that kids who have longer names know more letters and they have better alphabet skills. So go with, like, well, you can come Jezebel or something like that. But this is actually an important predictor of children's future reading achievement. Kids who can write their name at 4 and 4.5 tend to be better readers several years down the road. This is, what if this lecture was an hour of looking at my kids writing? I just have to show you this one because this is a very important early achievement in what we call text structure knowledge. And this is, again, my son, and he's actually he's made a grocery list, and it says banana, apple, apple. And what you see here, and this is going to go to the heart of what print knowledge is he is internalizing various strict rules about how we organize and use print for different purposes. So here, without any direct instruction ever, he is creating a list, and he understands that a list needs to be like this, and that there are specific rules governing this particular type of text structure. And in fact, there's other rules that govern other types of text structures, like if you were going to put a sign on your bedroom door. You might not be able to see that. That is a sign that appeared on my daughter's door, and it says, "Do not enter," because because when I'm sleeping, I don't want you bother me. And what this does is it shows you some of the really important things young kids are doing in reading and writing. This is her about 5 years of age. She's about 2 or 3 years ahead of other kids. But she is using print for a very, very clear purpose. She's following very specific rules. When she needed to append more information to her original sign, she appended it right on the bottom. But if you could see this, one of the things she does is her words move back and forth in forward order, back order. She splits words in pieces. So it's just another example of how we can really look at what young kids are doing at quite young ages, and we see the glimpses of these foundations put in place. This stuff is cute, but it's also very, very developmentally important. And so when I talk about print knowledge, first and foremost, it's a multidimensional construct. That means it's lots of different things. For instance, it's children's alphabet knowledge. By 5 years of age, most children are starting to learn some letters. Many children know all the letters, but there's also children who know no letters whatsoever. And so we see these early gaps form prior to 3 years of age. If you talk to any preschool teacher working in the pre-K year, and that teacher has kids who know every letter and kids who know no letters. So you get this distribution like this at very early ages in place. And that's a real task for a preschool teacher to figure out how to make things more even among kids. So it's a multidimensional construct. It includes alphabet knowledge. It also involves print concepts, understanding how print works and the rules that govern it. And it also includes early writing. And so this is an example of a child about 5 years of age. The cat had died, and the child wrote, "Kitty is dead, bye-bye kitty," and then labels it. And you see all this early sorry, it was actually my cat. And it was a mean cat, so I never feel sad when I show this slide. But we can think about print knowledge. Again, it's a multidimensional construct, and it captures all these early discoveries children are making about print. And I like to describe it as 4 dimensions. So we have book and print organization, or how books work. Books, you have print moving from left to right. You have a title page. You have an author. And everything is organized in a very particular way. You also have print meaning. I put that in the middle. The functional value of print is probably the most important aspect of print. We only want children to learn to read so they can use it purposefully. But children learn that print conveys messages and that print has information. So when children see the word "stop" on a sign, they understand the functional value of that. We see children playing with print in the environment. 50% of 3-year-olds are starting to play with words in the environment and read them, so to speak. And then at the bottom, you see understanding letters and words. And these are all things that kids are figuring out in the early years. So with respect to print meaning, they understand that print carries meaning. Print is different than pictures. Print has very, very specific rules that we need to follow. With respect to letters, children are learning that letters make up words. If any of you work with children, the next time you're around a 4-year-old child, ask them, "Show me just one letter on the cover of this book." or show me one word. And you're going to see how kids get really confused about what a letter is and what a word is and how letters make up words. But they're sorting this out. And a lot of kids have to do it on their own because we never sit down and give them good guidance. And then they walk into kindergarten classrooms and the teacher says, okay, we're going to learn how this sound goes with this letter. And these are very abstract ideas that kids are picking up. But again, some kids, they find this difficult. And as I mentioned, figuring out what a word is, and that word hello that my son wrote gave you an illustration of how kids are still sorting out what a word is and that there are rules that govern the notion of word. So this is this multi-dimensional construct called print knowledge. And what I want to do is spend a few minutes talking about some of the evidence that helps us understand how important this is. And so I'm going to cover about a decade of research done by lots and lots of people across the United States and elsewhere. But the first premise is that young children's print knowledge is consistently predictive of their future reading skill. So how do we get to that point? What supports that point? Well, a lot of the substantiation of a point like that comes from longitudinal research. How many of you are researchers? How many of you are in school trying to become a researcher? How many of you have to read research because you're a student? Okay, so we all live in a world of research. This is a particular type of study on the right. I didn't do this study. This is from a group of researchers across the US who tracked about 1,200 kids for about 16 years. And these are data on a certain set of skills that were measured repeatedly. And what you see across the top is you see time, 36 months, 54 months, first grade and third grade. And what you have here are selected variables that measure, and I won't talk about this very deeply, it's hard to see the details, but in essence, you have measures collected of children's language and literacy skills at each of these points. At 3 years, you have a measure of oral language skill. At 54 months, you have a measure of oral language skill, a measure of vocabulary skill specifically, a measure of alphabet knowledge, and a measure of what's called phonological awareness. And then first grade, you start to be able to measure kids' ability to read. Usually by first grade, kids can begin to read in a conventional sense. And at third grade, you have a measure of reading comprehension. By third grade, you can usually reliably measure reading comprehension in kids. That's when their skills have consolidated enough that they can read for meaning and answer questions about it. And basically, what I want you to appreciate about this are all those lines that go from 3 years all the way to third grade reading comprehension. Anywhere there's a line, that means there was a significant positive predictive pathway between the two variables at 2 points in time. The take-home message is that language and literacy skills that we measure in kids starting at 3 years of age are reliably associated with their reading comprehension skills 4 and 5 and 6 years down the pathway. If you don't believe these guys, there's studies like this all over the place. If you're really into structural equation modeling and you want to practice your skills, get a database that has preschool measures of literacy and later reading outcomes, and you see all sorts of positive pathways. On the left, this was actually a study of only children in Head Start. So these were all children who were from disadvantaged home in terms of household income. On the right side, if you want to get beyond the American perspective, these were Canadian kids. The models hold up there too. Canadian kids tend to learn to read the same way as American kids. But across all of these models, what you see are positive predictive correlations over time. If you have kids at 4 years of age, 5 years of age, who know their letters, who can write their name, who can deal with books, who know what a word is, they tend to be better readers later on. These things tend to play out over time. If you're really digging this stuff, I would encourage you to pull down this volume. This just came out 3 years ago from the National Institute of Family Literacy. And this is a meta-analysis or a systematic review of all the papers that have ever been done of the kind I just showed you. And they looked at literally hundreds of papers to try to understand, well, among young kids, what are the most important skills that are positively associated with future reading achievement. And the results of this is a free government publication, so you might want to add it to your library. But what this report shows you is that things like alphabet knowledge explain about 25% of the variance in future reading ability. So the things that I'm talking about, there's strong evidence that says these are important. Are they the only things that matter? No. But I'm an interventionist, and so I'm interested in knowing about the things that matter to future reading achievement that are malleable, that are things that we can change, because then those are targets for intervention. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. If print knowledge is important, it's relevant then to learn about the individual differences among young children in this skill. And in fact, we see early gaps emerge early. And so these are, there's a group of children that I'm very interested in. These are kids who are said to have SLI, and SLI stands for specific language impairment. And these are kids who have extraordinarily difficult times learning language for no known reason. It tends to be genetically transmitted. So these are kids who are 5 years old and they might talk, they might sound like a 3-year-old, for instance. And so that's a group of children I'm very interested in. And if you look at this group, on the upper graph shows you at 4 years of age how many letters on average kids with language impairment know compared to SES and age-matched, typically developing children. And you see a threefold difference. On the bottom, you see a measure of name writing skill. You can collect name writing tasks from kids, and you can actually score them for their developmental complexity. And what you see is kids who are typically developing write their names much, much better than kids who have SLI. These data are almost identical if I showed you a comparison of kids from poor and non-poor homes. They're almost identical. The causes for the differences are different, but what we would call the phenotype, or what these kids look like, actually is quite similar. And if we look more generally at kids, we see that children who have weak language skills are very vulnerable for weak print knowledge. This is an example of some work we did. This is about 500 4-year-old kids all participating in preschools serving at-risk kids. So this is public pre-K, Head Starts, and other types of subsidized programs. And what you see here across the bottom are measures of grammar, vocabulary. Those are traditional language assessments. And then you have measures of print knowledge, print concepts, alphabet knowledge, name writing, and then this rhyme assessment. And this is a statistical approach called cluster analysis, where you're looking and finding out if there are certain profiles of kids by which they, if there's certain, we actually often call it classes, or there's certain classes of kids or profiles that describe them. And so when we look across the sample of 500 kids, what we see is there's 5 reliable groups of kids with respect to their language and literacy skill, and that language and literacy abilities tend to be hand in hand. In particular, if you look at this group at the bottom, right here, this is profile 5. This is about 30% of kids are in this profile, where these kids have poor skills across language and literacy, and particularly the print knowledge measures. They all seem to hang together. And then you have these other groups of kids who are high overall. These kids here, who have these co-occurring legs in language and print knowledge in the early years, are the ones with whom we need to be most concerned. Because what happens over time is this. as I showed you, when we look at these kids, all kids, any kids, at 4.5, 5, and we take these simple measures like alphabet knowledge or name writing, and we see those differences, right? Those differences don't go away. So this is an example of a study we did of children who had a language impairment at 54 months compared to kids who don't have a language impairment. And that 54-month is basically their early literacy skill with respect to print knowledge. And what you see as we model their reading development from 1st grade, 3rd grade, and 5th grade, that gap never goes away. In fact, you can't really see it here, but the kids with language impairment actually accelerate a little bit in the first few years, but they never can overcome that gap. If you don't believe us, other people see the same thing. These are data from an epidemiological study across all of Iowa. And you see the same patterns over time, which should emphasize the importance of closing that gap in early literacy skill before kids walk in to beginning reading instruction. There are some kids who are going to walk into beginning reading instruction. We can't close that gap. And they're going to need a lot of supplemental help. And hopefully that will be effective for having their reading skills be like that of other kids. But for an awful lot of kids, we can close that gap. And we ought to, because it's not that hard. And I'll talk to you more about that. And so the next point is that this whole cascade of effects, if we understand the skills that are important predictors of reading achievement, and if we know that this early gap is one that many kids can't overcome, well, can't we prevent those future reading difficulties by closing the gap at that initial point? And we're in a very, very exciting time right now, because a lot of research teams across the US, including people here at the University of Washington, are developing interventions that are efficacious for closing that gap early on. We have a lot of work to do as a research community in longitudinally following kids who receive these early interventions. But there's a lot of things to get excited about. This is an example of a program that we developed for West Virginia, the West Virginia Department of Ed. If you've ever been to West Virginia, it's the only state that's entirely Appalachian, which is why I love it, because I'm Appalachian by genealogy. But it's a very, very interesting place to go to because it's geographically insane. I mean, maybe it's kind of like that here in Washington, but you know, there's a lot of mountains and they never had a good infrastructure developed there. And so we worked to get a program that any teacher across West Virginia could hopefully drop into their preschool classroom and engage in systematic instruction twice a week, and we'd start to be able to close the gap. This program is totally free of charge. It's a free download, and teachers in West Virginia and elsewhere pull it down, apply this twice a week for 30 weeks, and they're able to close the gap quite a bit for when kids leave the classroom and enter into kindergarten. We don't know if that early closure results in long-term shifts, but we do have some evidence from other intervention work that we've done that is somewhat convincing, and so I'll share that with you. So hopefully this has emphasized for you the importance of designing early literacy interventions that can target the skills that we think are important to future reading success. And that if we can design these interventions and get them into classrooms, which is a whole different conversation, that we can actually prevent reading problems from occurring for a large majority of children who are otherwise at risk. And so what I want to do is talk to you about the work we've been doing, trying to design early literacy interventions. And the work I'm going to share with you actually goes back 15 years. Because doing this kind of work ought to proceed fairly slowly, surely, and thoughtfully. Otherwise, we ask teachers to do things that are not substantiated, and then they just get thrown out 2 or 3 years later. And it's very frustrating for teachers. But this all began in the 90s when we started to learn about how important print knowledge was for children, and we wanted to learn how to transmit print knowledge to kids who are at risk. And so we started to look at the literature for theoretical guides for how do young children learn about print, because our idea was if we can learn how children learn about print, typically, then what we can do is apply those practices to children who are at risk or who need additional intervention. And if you looked at the literature at that time, it was all about osmosis. And it was that children, young children, magically internalize knowledge about print, form, and functions by hanging out with adults. And there were 3 or 4 really influential papers, theoretical papers, that basically said children learn all these things about print by internalizing knowledge when they interact with adults. So, this is actually a policy recommendation that came out of a volume that was deeply influential in 1998. There was a volume that came out from the National Reading Council called Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children, which really planted the kernel for everything that everybody's doing right now. So this is 14 years down the road. To me, it feels like yesterday. I remember when this book came out. It was really exciting to me. And in that book, it said there's a lot of young children who are at risk and who don't know a lot about print, and we need to change that if we're going to prevent reading difficulties. And it said, basically, this is how children learn about print, and therefore, if you can read more to children, they will be able to internalize more about print. So we took this on and began to ask more seriously, well, what does this look like for children who have limited print experiences? Are they internalizing what they know about print? Is it sufficient for them to adequately develop print knowledge so that they can transition into school? This is a guy, Oscar, sitting on the lap of his mom. This is in a town I go to. Actually, I'm going there again in about 3 weeks, in Merida, Mexico, where the children have virtually no print materials in their community. And he has severe autism and cerebral palsy. What about guys like Oscar? Is he internalizing print form and functions? How does this happen for children with whom we need to be concerned? And so our work has proceeded through a program of research. If anybody in this room is interested in designing interventions, for a long time there was a paradigm for how this would take place. It comes from a medical model for designing clinical outcome research in such areas as cancer treatment, depression treatment. And typically what happens is there's basically 4 stages of research, which is called identification research, where you're looking at the mechanisms. So if you're trying to develop depression medicine, you want to understand, what does depression look like? How does it work? We call this lab science. Oftentimes people are working with animal models at this phase. And then you shift to what's called feasibility tests. And feasibility tests, a lot of scientists thumb their nose at this stuff, and we shouldn't. Feasibility tests are early tests of intervention potential. So you might work with really small groups. You might, if you're into research design, you might not have a control group. You might use lousy measures. It's hard to get this stuff published because we're kind of snobby about it. But we shouldn't be, because this is the right type of research to happen at a certain period of time. And this is very prominent in the medical field, where you think this depression medicine works and you try it with a very small group of people. You want to make sure nobody dies, people are happy, people come in for their treatment. This stuff is important to know if you should keep investing. And so if the early tests of intervention potential are good, then you move to what are called true experimental design studies, where you have a treatment group and a control group. And those are usually very, very tightly controlled interventions where you want to find out, does something work? Can we say that this causes this? And those are called tests of efficacy. And then you have what's called stage 4 research or scale-up research, where you put stuff into the community. This is when doctors start doing what's called off-label usage of things. So you have ADHD was proven in efficacy tests for treatment of attention deficit disorder, and then people start saying, well, it could also be used as a diet drug. Oh, that's not a good idea. But that stuff usually happens at the scale-up level, and you start studying, well, what happens when this medicine or this treatment or this intervention or this educational program, if it has good impacts in tightly controlled situations, what happens when it goes out there in the field of practice? Does it still hold up? Now, we're in a funny place right now. This is the way things should go, but there's two major problems with it. One of them, it takes forever. We're talking 20, 30, 40 years. This is not okay if we want to help children we're concerned with today. So it's very slow. The second thing that's wrong with it is in 2001, there was a little educational law that came out called No Child Left Behind. And No Child Left Behind put in law that teachers need to use research-based practices. That's the first time use of research practices was ever mentioned in educational law. And what happened is in a lot of areas, we didn't have the research available to help teachers to have things that had good evidence of causal impacts on kids. Perfect example is preschool curricula. In preschools across the USA, there are two primary curricula used, high scope and creative. They've got the market. They have the market. Well, do they work? Do they work? If preschool teachers are required to use research-based practices that have known demonstrated impacts on kids, well, what do we know about these two curricula? Do they work? Are they evidence-based? So we kind of got ourselves in a tricky place right now where teachers are being told you must use research-proven techniques, and yet we don't have the research. So we're in a place right now where the US government is actually funding a lot of studies of this type where this work didn't go on. So it's kind of a funny place to be. But our work, we were kind of doing all this stuff before everything got crazy. So we've been able to sort of move along in a slow way, and we really did start at the identification level. We were working in a vacuum. We knew that print knowledge was important. We wanted to help children develop this who were lagging in this area, but there were no interventions out there, and we didn't really know where to start. You really can't understand what this place was like 15 years ago. And so we started like this. We said, well, let's watch parents reading to their children, because this must be the place where children are learning about print. And let's find out how children are learning about print in this context, and then we can steal those ideas and design interventions. So one of the first studies we did, we actually got a group of parents who read to their 4-year-old children, and we picked this book purposefully because this is a book that is very, very print rich. I don't have Dear Zoo here, but I have one that's quite similar, Spot Goes to a Party. And these are storybooks that are very, very print rich. They have relatively few words per page. The print is really big. There's print embedded in the illustrations. And so we thought, we're going to watch parents reading this book to their children. We're going to learn how they're helping their kids internalize all this knowledge in these books. And we picked this book purposefully in this context, purposefully, to then guide us. And here is what happened. We watched these parents reading to their kids, and we videotaped them. We very carefully coded for anything that happened that had to do with the print in the book. And so we looked at questions about print, which would be something like, you know, where should I read on this page? Or what is this letter? What does this sign say? And what we found is that, well, there weren't any questions about print going on to study and learn about. And there weren't too many comments about print going either. In fact, that's rate, 0.5 per minute. So in a typical 10-minute reading session, you have maybe 5 of these happening on average across the parents we studied. We also looked at tracking and pointing, though, because we thought maybe this is a nonverbal thing that's going on. And we got a little bit more traction there. We saw about 1 tracking the print when you read per minute, and a little bit of pointing every once in a while. This was actually a huge surprise for us. More surprising was this. This was a study of just 12 parents, but we studied them very deeply, what was happening. And the second column is the rate of print questions. We really wanted to understand question-answer routines as a particular mechanism for helping coach kids to learn about print. And what you actually see is only 2 parents even ask questions. So that whole effect here of that tiny, that very little bit of print talk, those print questions we saw, was actually the result of 2 parents. So 10 parents reading to their 4-year-old kids this very print-rich book, never questioned about print whatsoever. And so we came to realize that there really is not much verbal or nonverbal interaction on the part of the parents that seems to be helping kids internalize knowledge about print. So not to be discouraged, we thought, well, maybe the kids are studying the print on their own, and this is what's happening. And so we worked with an engineer who had an eye gaze system, and he allowed us to track what 4-year-old kids were looking at as we read them storybooks. And in this study, we actually read them 2 different storybooks. The Very Hungry Caterpillar, we picked because, I don't have this study was a while ago. I can't find any of these books anymore. But the Very Hungry Caterpillar we picked because the print is very, very small, like these Clifford books. You need a microscope to read the print. But then you see on the right side, we picked a Spot book this time. The print is very, very robust as a part of these books. So you have the narrative print across the top, and there you see print embedded in the pictures. Mom is carrying a list with words on it, and you have that sign at the bottom. And what you see, those lines around the print are what we're able to do is demarc print zones, called regions of interest. And we can actually look at what kids are looking at. So those black dots are kids' visual fixations as they look at the pages of the book. So you have the fixations, and then you have the lines between fixations are what are called saccades, where you fixate and then you move, you fixate, you move. And so we could actually find out, well, when we read books to kids, we're not talking about print, we're not touching the print, but they must be looking at it as a means to learning about print. And what we find out is exactly what you see here, which is when you read The Very Hungry Caterpillar, children 2% of the time would even go near the print. They're never looking at the print when you read The Very Hungry Caterpillar. On the right side, what we found is when we read these more print-rich books, they're looking at the print about 5% of the time. It's still very little, but it's actually a lot more than you see in The Very Hungry Caterpillar. If you look on the right side, what you have is actually the average percent of time spent looking at print for The Very Hungry Caterpillar. And this is Spot. And what you actually should notice here is that those are what we call almost non-overlapping distributions. So even though the overall mean amount of time looking at print is quite low, about 2% versus 5%, that's actually quite a big difference when you start looking at how the data is laid out. So we wanted to explore this more. So we thought, okay, kids are not looking at print much, but if we read them certain books, they're looking at print a little bit more. Let's play with this and see what happens. And so we designed a study where we read 4 of the Spot books. I'm sure the librarian scholars in the audience are trembling at the great literature selection here. But we liked Spot for 2 reasons. Number one, big, big, vibrant print. Lots of opportunities to talk about print. And there's actually a whole series of these things. So you can use multiple books and switch them out and not get repeated reading effects. So we used Spot Goes to School, Spot Goes to a Party, and then 2 others I can't recall. And we actually read to, these were 4-year-old kids, and we actually read to each of the children 4 different ways, all different Spot books. And we just read to the kids normally. Or we read while we talked about the pictures. Oh, look at Spot. He's smiling. He has a flower. But then we had these 2 conditions where we read while talking about the print, and we read while pointing to the print. So we systematically built in those behaviors that we didn't see parents doing, but we thought might be influential. And what you see is a pretty dramatic effect where, again, this is the percentage of time kids are looking at print during a complete reading of each of these books. And so what you see is verbatim reading and talking about the pictures as we read these books, we see very little looking at print, about 2% of the time, kind of like what we saw with The Very Hungry Caterpillar. However, if we're reading these books and we periodically talk about the print that's in them or track the print when we read, we see children looking at the print a bit more. One of the things actually, the reason we had to think about this more seriously is we sent this paper to a journal for review, and they really came down on us and said, that's such a small effect, who cares? The kids are only looking at print 5% of the time when you read with this, what we called at that time, a print style. And we had to think about that. And what we did is we extrapolated what the two experiences look like. If a child's being read for 10 minutes a day, 7 days a week, over 365 days, and you read and never talk about the print, how many times does a child's eyes touch on the print? It's about 20,000 times. If you read to them 10 minutes a day and you infuse a few comments or questions about print, you actually get about 39,000 flickers on print. And the paper actually was published. But they made us think about this. Well, what 20,000 looks at print in the context of storybook reading, does that even matter? We didn't know. We didn't know at that time. We certainly would hope so. So then we moved to what we would call feasibility work, where the identification research is saying, well, a lot of parents who are reading with their kids aren't talking about the print. And by the way, nobody likes this finding, but the vast majority of studies of parent-child reading behavior show that the parents don't talk about anything. So it's not just that they don't talk about print, they don't talk about anything. About 66% of parents use a style that's called limited input, very little talk going on. So we have this body of identification work at this point saying, well, there's not much conversation about print going on. We thought that was going to be an important ingredient. Kids don't look a lot at print when we read to them normally, but if we start to manipulate certain things about book reading, we can coax them to look more often at print. And that actually could be a gap or a difference that could magnify over time and could be important. So we wanted to play with this more, and we moved to what we called feasibility work, which is we wanted to find out, is this actually a malleable behavior? The way parents read with kids, or adults read with kids, or speech language pathologists read with kids or teachers, is this malleable, having adults use some of the behaviors that we had been trialing in lab-based settings? And so in this particular study, we had a group of parents who read a book with their child, and actually we used, again, something in the spot book. The parents read to their child, and then for half of the parents, they came back a week later. They read, we coded it, and they came back a week later, and for half of the parents, we had them watch a 7-minute video. And this was actually VHS, and we carted around a little TV. And it wasn't that long ago, by the way. It was like 10 years ago, and that's what life was like. Maybe not in Seattle, but in the rest of the world, that's what we were doing, carting around these VHS videos. And so the parents would watch this 7-minute video, and all it did was say, look at this mother reading to her child. And the mother would read to her child, and he actually had Down syndrome, and she would talk about print as she read. So it's called observational learning. Can you change behaviors by simply seeing somebody do something differently? And lo and behold, then we had those parents and the other parents who didn't watch the video read to their child. And we coded, this is actually everything added up across all 5, what we call print referencing behaviors: questions about print, comments about print, requests about print, tracking the print, pointing to print, anything. And what you see is parents who read twice but never saw the video, just read the same way a week or 2 apart, whatever the pre and post test interval was. The treatment parents, or the parents who are going to watch the video, you see before they watch the video, they read to the kids, they look just like the control parents. They watch the video, and we see this really dramatic change. It's actually not crazy dramatic, but it's dramatic. So they're talking to their kids about 3 times in a reading session, which is quite a bit more than we were seeing before. So this is saying to us, feasibility-wise, this is actually a malleable behavior, and it's actually easy to change, easy to change. So then we moved, and there's a couple other feasibility studies I'm not sharing with you here, but then we moved to a set of efficacy studies, and these spanned about 2000 to last week, maybe 2 years ago. But we did a whole series of efficacy studies, and with an efficacy study, there's one thing you're really trying to do: make a causal claim. If you do X, it has an impact on Y. So they're designed a certain way. The first study we did, we had 30 mother-child pairs, and these were typical moms and a couple grandmothers, no dads, who read to their child for 4 weeks. And every week, the mom would get a new book, and we would say, read it 4 times. So they read 16 times over 4 weeks, and the parents in the top group, we said, talk about print, and actually we had them watch that video. We like the video now. So we have them watch the video, and we say, now read, and you might want to use those strategies. And the other moms, we say, read as you normally read. This is an efficacy study. And what we saw across various measures of print knowledge, that's what we care about, what we see, 16 reading sessions. Here, these are gain scores. This is growth for the kids whose moms read normally, and those are kids whose mom talked about print. And what we see with that, with the exception of alphabet knowledge, we see that this very subtle difference between the 2 groups is actually getting a thrust on things we care about. The one thing that we also found out about this study that was influential, all these mothers, God, it's so funny to think about this, they got a cassette tape, a cassette tape. Do you know what that looks like? Yeah. We still have these, and we want to recode something. We're like, no, we can't even find tape recorders anymore. And we would give every mother a cassette tape for every week. They would get an envelope, the cassette tape, and they had a little, like a Walkman type of audio recorder. And they would read their 4 books and then mail us the audio tape, and we would listen to them, because we wanted to make sure they read talking about print and the other mothers. And what we found out is there were a couple mothers who turned into monsters. And and thank goodness that we did that. That was a measure of fidelity. But I was listening to these, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this mother's like, what's that letter? What's that letter? And I'm like, stop, stop. So that was actually really good for me to listen to this and think, oh boy, we don't want to destroy the love of reading, right? That's called a broccoli effect. When you make a child do something every day, then they will never do it again for the rest of their life. And so I actually got nervous, and all the work we've done since then, this was an important point. We have I'm going to talk about a few more studies, and we have talk about print embedded within storybook reading in classrooms and homes, and we try to keep it at a very, very modest level, because we don't want to ruin this context for kids. We want it to be enjoyable, and 98% of the times it actually is. I wanted to mention, again, usually the general rule of thumb, if you don't know this, from the American Psychological Association and from the Institute of Education Science, if you have 2 well-conducted efficacy studies that show causal impacts on something, you can call something evidence-based or empirically validated. That's kind of the rule of thumb. The publishers who make curricula and stamp them with empirically validated aren't abiding by that rule. So we did another efficacy study, and in this one, we worked in Head Start classrooms, and we had 38 children in Head Start who were randomly assigned to 2 conditions. And in this case, a speech-language pathologist actually several implemented the interventions. And the kids got 8 weeks, 3 times a week. Working in this class, in this center, we were actually pulling the kids out and reading in small groups, and the center director really didn't want us doing this 4 or 5 times a week, so we went in Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And so it was almost exactly the same as the parent study, but the kids were read to more times with slightly longer gaps between readings. And these are the differences that we see across groups over a 2-month period. And these are 4 measures of print knowledge. I'm not going through the details of the measures. Happy to send any of these articles to you. But what you see, oh, you don't even see the legend. The light blue kids are the children who got the 8 weeks of reading and talk about the pictures. And then the kids, the blue, the royal blue, got talk about print. Now in this study, this was a transition point, and what we do here is you can only talk about print 9 times max. And in fact, in our work now with teachers, we say 6. And what I mean by that is talk about print might be, in this study, this book is Scott Goes to School. Where's the title of this book? Oh, who can help me figure out the words in the title? So you might have like 3 discussions about print on the cover and then maybe 1 or 2 times as you continue to read. So we really tried to put a lid on how much of this happened, and still we see fairly large impacts on kids over this 2-month period. And this is an example of what the 2 reading conditions would look like. So the children who were being read to with a picture focus, they would have discussion with the speech language pathologist who was reading, and the questions embedded would look like this. What do you think this book's about? What's he doing? Why is the dog so sad? So they would talk about the illustrations. Whereas the kids who were in the print condition, it might, where's the title of this book? Can you find the letter S on this page? Can you find a really long word on this page? No more than 9 of those maximum. Well, I won't go there. Okay. I wanted to mention there was a more recent study we did. Actually, the study happened a while ago, but we didn't publish it until it came out last year. But, oh, I'm missing an arrow too. But this was a study of parents reading to children with specific language impairment. Having parents implement interventions in their home is something that lots of people are keen on, and I was until I did this study. But these were parents, and their children had specific language impairment. Many of these parents lived in rural poverty across Ohio and West Virginia Appalachian regions. And the parents read for 12 weeks, and it was 4 sessions a week. And the parents got a book each week, and they audio taped everything. And what we did in this study is we actually had little suggestions on the page for the parents. A lot of parents of kids who have specific language impairment have a language impairment themselves. This runs in families. So we added some scaffolding devices, and we called the parents every week to talk to them about how it's going. We were listening to the audio tapes. And so we had actually 3 conditions for that study, talking about print, talking about pictures, and then we also had a condition where we had the parents talk about sound structures in the book, like rhyme and initial sounds of words. So we wanted to get a more direct comparison where parents were doing what might look like teaching during storybook reading instead of pictures. And for that study, we actually transcended feasibility, efficacy, and social validity. I won't bore you with these details, but I am increasingly concerned about some of the things that we ask parents to do. And so the feasibility, I'm actually concerned about this with respect to teachers as well. The feasibility question, all the prior studies of parent-child book reading in home environments, nobody had asked parents to do this for 12 weeks. There's the assumption we want parents to read for long, long periods of time, but nobody had ever done a real test of a 3-month reading intervention. And all the other studies that had been done that get a lot of press, the parents are very self-selected, typically middle-class parents self-selecting into these studies. This was a convenient sample, but the parents were gone after because their kids had disabilities. So it's a slightly different group. And then we also wanted to see if our efficacy findings would also map on to these more vulnerable children. Would we get the same effects for kids who have disabilities? Other studies of shared book reading, if anybody knows about something called dialogic reading, that intervention does not hold up for kids with disabilities, although nobody actually will acknowledge that. But the work that's out there does not show good effects for kids who have impairments. And then also, much of this literature has not looked at parents reading to kids with disabilities. Parents of kids with disabilities tend to have a lot of different concerns than parents of typical children. So we really wanted to look more deeply. FYI, 24% of our parents never completed 12 weeks of reading. This is not an issue that anybody who does this kind of work talks about. If you start reading if anybody here is familiar with the book reading intervention literature, start looking at their subject selections, and nobody takes this on. We worked with these parents very, very closely. We gave them books, we called them, and parents just couldn't sustain this, and we knew why. Health-related issues. We had parents who got sick, and we were working with the rural poor. It wasn't trivial things either. Time constraints. We had parents who went back to school. We had a lot of single parents. They took a second job. A number of moms got pregnant and gave birth. I can tell you, my husband had to do all the reading when I was going through birth. Custody issues, parent-reported difficulty with reading. So we had parents, only 75% of parents could really sustain this to completion. And it did not differ as a function of the group parents were in. So we obviously wanted to know, well, are the parents all leaving from our print-focused? It didn't make a difference what condition they were in. And our effects were not very strong. These are the three groups. So we have kids, their parents are reading with a print focus, reading with a picture focus, and then reading and talking about phonological awareness or sounds of words. If you look across the alphabet measure, these are just post-test scores. What you see is that the control group, whose parents talked about phonological awareness, actually outperformed our print kids on print measures. That shouldn't have happened. That's not good. At the same time, on the print concepts measure to the right, our kids whose parents read with a print focus, they did outperform the other kids, and it was significantly so. But these are not the kind of effects you want to see. If you're doing a print-focused intervention, you want to see parents be able to implement what you're asking them to implement. And you also want to see effects in favor of your treatment group. And we didn't see that. And so we're still playing with this. But there is the possibility of diminishing returns when you're working with high-risk populations. And what I would say is that we have to look at different tactics and asking parents to do more, particularly parents who might be vulnerable themselves. This might not be a good route. Okay, so let me just talk briefly. I mentioned earlier identification, research, feasibility, efficacy, and then that last one was scale up. So we have an intervention at this time that we've developed. It's what I call soft scripted. It's free. Nobody's making money off this thing. What happens if it goes out there to scale? Can it hold up in broader populations? We had 2 studies that were very tightly controlled, one in Head Start, one with parents, and then the specific language impairment study. We have 2 studies that say if you do this approach, this intervention approach with young kids, it has positive impacts on measures we care about in the area of print knowledge. Well, what happens if people just start doing this on their own in a larger diversity of settings? We've been involved with 2 projects. The second one is still underway, STAR 1 and STAR 2. It stands for Sit Together and Read. The first study is done. We're on the tail end of dissemination for that one. But we had 83 preschool teachers, all serving high-risk children. These are all targeted enrollment classrooms across Ohio and Virginia. And what we do in a study like that is we have 83 teachers, and we randomly assign the teacher to conditions so that all the kids in the classroom get the condition of their teachers. And I'll tell you about the conditions in that study in a moment. And in a study like that, what we usually do is we sample a few kids from their classroom, usually 4 or 5 kids that we randomly select. We don't need to learn about all the kids in the classroom. If we randomly pick a few, we can make inferences across all the kids in the classroom. And these teachers read for 30 weeks. And these teachers are in several states. Their kids look different than the ones we worked with our prior studies. So this is a pretty good test of what happens if we put an intervention like this in more everyday circumstances. The second study, STAR 2, it's in its 4th year, 3rd to 4th year. We have 84 preschool teachers in 3 conditions. All of those classrooms are early childhood special ed with an inclusion framework. So they typically are half typical children and half kids with identified disabilities. And that one is still underway. So what this project, this is what we call an effectiveness study or a scale-up study. This is the project. This is how we recruit teachers into it. These are all the books. So we say to the teacher, if you sign up for this study, well, we tell them a whole bunch of things. You have to agree to random assignment, and you can't divulge the condition you're in. We have to say that up front, and they have to agree, and we guilt them. We say, if you do, you'll destroy a $5 million study. And then we say you're going to get a book a week. You're going to get a book every week. They like that. And these teachers also get a video camera, and they videotape themselves every 2 weeks and mail the video to us. And by this point, at this point in the life cycle of this research, we're working with little memory cards that they mail us. We're still not doing fully network-based, which will be a dream come true when we get there. But so these teachers actually videotape. We have 15 videos for every one of these teachers. They mail them to us, and we code them for exactly what's happening. This is just this intervention that I'm sharing with you costs about $200 for a teacher to implement. Our teachers aren't paying a thing, but what the teachers, if a teacher was to do this intervention, they need about $200 worth of books. These are all commercial books, and we have all this laid out on the web and in research articles. Anybody can do this. We read Silver Seeds in book 1. And then we have certain targets related to print that are aligned to each book, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. But week 3 is Mice Squeak, We Squeak, One Duck Stuck, and every one of those is basically an instructional objective related to print knowledge. And the way that we support implementation is that with every book, the teacher gets a star card, and the star card just goes right in the book. It's one piece of paper, costs 2 cents. We give these. This is the star card for In the Small, Small Pond, and we say, when you read this, we want you to talk about concept of word, and then we give suggestions for how you might do that, and then print direction. Talk about how print moves on a page. All of these are in this Guilford book. A teacher can buy this for like $20. Disclosure, I receive about $200 in royalties annually for that book. Which is actually very, very small. So in terms of conflict of interest, you might as well just trust what I'm saying. So one of the things that's interesting, as I mentioned to you, the teachers mail us a video every 2 weeks, and we actually code those almost immediately. And we have a complex coding system. It's called the Fidelity coding scheme. And we sit there and we actually tally exactly how much talk about print is going on and whether the teachers are talking about the 2 targets that we said should go with this book. Just as an FYI, this is how easy this intervention is. These are growth curves. This is week 2, week 4, week 6. Corresponding, we got the video. This is about 80 teachers or so. We code. And what you see here are 4 lines. The darkest line is, I should clarify. So this is across the y-axis, the number of times we talked about print on this coding scheme. So the dark line is actually the average across all the teachers. The one at the bottom is our control teachers. Did I mention that they get the same book every week as well? So the teachers who are control group teachers get the same book every week. And we say, read as you normally read. And they don't know why they're in this study. They think it's just the best thing in the world. We give them a book, they read it how they want, they videotape it. You know, they don't care, they love it. And then the 2 groups at the top, you see the squares and the triangles. We had 2 groups of teachers in this study. So we said, you're going to get a book and read as you normally read, or you're going to read and you're going to get a star card with each book. But there was a subtle difference between the groups of teachers who were put in that star reading. For one group of teachers, we said, we want you to read every day. And for the other group of teachers, we said, read twice a week. So what you have here is the top row. It's not a row, but hopefully you know what I mean. This top group of teachers is our high dosage teachers. When I say high dosage, think read every day, talking about print. And then the next one is the low dosage, think read twice a week. And what you see is, it's interesting, you see a tiny difference between the higher and lower intensity readings, but they're very, very different from business as usual. So one of the things you can take away from this is teachers in preschool settings are talking about print very, very little as they engage in storybook reading with their kids. And by the way, all those books were selected because they have very rich print features in them. Well, what happens to kids? Now, again, these are everyday kids in pre-K classrooms across several states. This is after 1 year. So this is what we did is we pre-test these kids and then we post-test them fall and spring of the year. And these are the effect size differences for kids who we call the star kids. Their teachers read with a print focus. And this is just the everyday condition compared to kids whose teachers read in the regular condition. And what you see, these are, the axis is basically standard deviation units. So the kids on 3 measures of print knowledge after 1 year of exposure to this intervention, the kids whose teachers read and talked about print were outperforming the other kids whose teachers read the same books every day by about 0.5 of a standard deviation, 0.4 to 0.5. What I can tell you is that is comparable to anything you'll see from really high intensity, very expensive, heavy laden curricula people are putting in pre-K classrooms. That's why I like this work. Nobody's making a penny off it, and we're not exhausting teachers by asking them to do crazy things all day long. Well, going back to my early premise, we would think on the basis of longitudinal data that if at the end of preschool kids have an edge, that edge ought to play out in their reading trajectory. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. These are those same kids at the end of 1st grade. So these kids come into pre-K. The teachers read to them for 30 weeks in one way or another. We test them again. We test them at the end of kindergarten. We test them at the end of 1st grade. So this is actually 2 years post entering the study. And these assessors have no idea what kind of reading condition the kids got. So we gave the kids standardized assessments of, these are all from the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement, letter-word identification, a measure of decoding or word recognition, spelling and passage comprehension. And you see 3 groups. Everyday reading with a print focus, twice a week reading with a print focus, and then regular reading. And what you see is a difference of about about 0.3 of a standard deviation between the everyday group and the business as usual reading group. Their kids are in a better trajectory. Is it enough to make them all proficient readers several years down the road? Well, we don't know that right now. But what we do know is that by pushing these, by using a very modest intervention delivered by teachers that was not burdensome, very low cost, kids made gains in important skills over pre-K, and those effects lasted to 2 years later. So that's pretty exciting for us. I do want to mention that one of the things we've really been thinking about is I'm just as a person and as a researcher, I'm very sensitive. I design interventions and I test interventions. My career is based on the willingness of teachers to work with me and to be kind enough to let us into their classrooms and ask us to do things. So I'm very sensitive about what I'll ask teachers to do. And one of the things that drives me is an issue of dose. How much is enough of something to get a boost? So for instance, some of you are married. Some of you are in a relationship, right? Relationships ebb and flow, right? You have good years, you have bad years, you have great years, you have, and I've been married for 19 years, so we've had good years and we've had bad years. And so what if you saw a therapist and you're working on communicating better, and your therapist said, for 7 hours a day, I want you to sit next to your partner and have back and forth conversations, right? And another therapist said, if you woke up every morning and you sat and had coffee together and talked about why you loved each other for 2 minutes, which intervention, is it possible that you could get the same outcome? Is it possible? And we don't tend to ask questions like that. We are in a place where we think more is more and more is good. And that's not always the case. It's definitely not the case in medicine. A perfect example of that is chemotherapy. There's very specific dosage that you need to give in chemotherapy. And if you go over, it's not good. And so more is not better. And that's an issue of what we call dosing. So we happen to be sitting on an intervention because we have videotapes of teachers sending to us, and because what we're asking teachers to do is so readily observable, we can count to a very precise level exactly what's happening and think about how much of this is good for kids. And this is a model where we're trying to look at the interaction. Now remember, we have some kids getting this intervention 2 times a week and some getting it 4 times a week. And this is the growth curves I showed you of how much teachers are talking about print over the year with different books. And we can start to play with this and say, well, what if you have teachers who talk about print a lot 2 times a week? And other teachers talk about print not very much 4 times a week. How can we manipulate this so you can get the biggest bang for your buck with the less impact on teachers in classrooms? And so we've been playing with this. And these charts just get a little bit complicated to talk about. But we've been looking at our different outcomes on kids over the pre-K year. We have alphabet knowledge, print concepts, and name writing are 3 things we've been studying. And what we start to see to some extent is what we might call diminishing returns. And so some of these charts, when you get into 2- and 3-way interactions, are hard to wrap your head around. But basically, if you have a teacher who implements 4 times a week our intervention at a very low dosage, that means you read 4 times a week, but there's not much talk about print, the kids' growth looks very similar to having a high frequency with a very high dose. In other words, it might be that if you're going to read every day, you can just talk a little bit about print instead of doing it a lot. There's diminishing returns at a certain threshold. Does that make sense? The same thing is also true. It's possible that less is more. And what we see is when teachers do this twice a week, but talk a lot about print, where you have high every day and a lot of talk about print, we see equated outcomes in kids. So we're really playing with this a lot and trying to think about this issue of possibly diminishing returns, where you get to a point where kids just can't soak up anymore. Or possibly, what if we have higher intensity interventions, maybe doing something twice a week at a really high level might be better than doing something all the time. Kids need time for lots of other things too, so we don't want to just do language and literacy all the time. So I happen to think these are good questions to be asking about, a little bit hard to wrap your head around. So I will thank you. Hopefully you walked away with something, and I am happy to entertain any questions you might have.
I was wondering if in your viewing of the videotapes, listening to the tapes, that the teachers or the parents who focus on the print, do they start not talking about the pictures as much? And is there concern that social-emotional development or creative development might be affected by that?
Yeah, I think that is a very natural place to go. And so we've paid attention to this, and I'll respond to it in 2 ways. First of all, when we read with kids, the majority of reading interactions are what is called a limited input style. So you're actually not talking about anything in general. And what we have found is actually counter to the fact that when we get teachers to talk more about print, they start talking about a lot of different things too. And that's been a very exciting finding. So what we find is everything goes up. So it's not a bucket type of thing. So that's been exciting for us. And then the other one is, if teachers are doing this well and it's a positive climate, the socio-emotional aspects are actually enhanced because you get more discussion going in. Kids love to learn things. And so the repeated reading part of this intervention and other interventions is really fun to watch, because the teacher on the first day might say, what's this letter? And the kids don't know it. And she'll say, well, this is a letter in your name. And then the next day, the child's like, hey, there's that letter in my name. And so you actually see a really enriched dynamic taking place. We have been concerned about this. And so we have tried to take it on. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could remind me what the various directions you were giving them in reading. It was point to text, tracking text, and then there was 2 more.
Yeah, so in our early work, what we did is we talked about this omnibus set of print-related talk. And we said you can do verbal talk and nonverbal behaviors. And the verbal was questions about print, comments about print, and requests about print. So a question would be like, where should I read on this page? Show me where to read on this page would be a request. A comment would be like, oh, that's a really big word. And then the nonverbals were tracking the print when you read and pointing. In our more recent work with teachers, we don't even go that far. We just say, when you read this book, could you be sure to talk about these 2 aspects of print, like directionality and the difference between letters and words. And we don't go into do it this way or this way. But in our early work, we focused it more on the behaviors and not the content.
You didn't have a large response with the parents. Are you suggesting that as an educator, I not recommend to parents that they interact with the print or pictures or get that dialogue going?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And I'm glad you asked it because I don't think I want to be interpreted as saying that. What I would like to say, a lot of times, and really in speech-language intervention, and some of the allied health professionals, there's a common theme on asking parents to deliver the intervention. And so I have concerns about that. That as a therapist or a teacher, I think we have an important role to play, and we can work with parents for generalization. But I don't think a parent should do our job. They should be an asset or a complement to that. And I think, well, I'll just stop there. So that would be the point I'd want to make.
I think this is really an extension of the first question. As a preschool teacher, it's so natural to talk about what's happening in the pictures and to make that connection of print to meaning. And so it seems to me that if we start talking about what you're talking about, do the kids get bored? Can you keep them engaged?
Yeah.
It's very different than what I've done in my
Right.
case.
And one of the things we try to do, and we always use books where any discussion about print can be a very naturalistic part. So because what we want to do is not have it be decontextualized. So a really good example is Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus. If you don't know this book, put it on your reading list. Don't let the pigeon drive the bus. You have this pigeon going along. He really wants to drive the bus. He has speech bubbles. All of his words is in speech bubbles. There is if you're talking about the pictures, it could involve talking about the speech bubbles because it's really an artistic touch. And then he gets very upset and starts yelling. Print is part of the illustration. So there's a very natural vehicle to talking about written language in this book as a salient part. And so in a lot of our work, we look for books where it can be a natural part. This is actually a board book, Quiet, Loud. And on every page, you have things that are quiet and things that are loud. And anything that is loud is written in capital letters, and anything that's quiet is in lowercase letters. So that actually invites an opportunity to say, oh my gosh, that's loud, it's in capital letters. And it can be an honest part of the conversation. So we're always looking for books where that can be the case. Now, if you're reading Clifford's Good Deeds and you start talking about the letters, the kids are going to think you're weird and tell you to stop, right? Yeah. Good comment. Oh, I will tell you, if you're into children's books, I don't know if you've seen this one, Scaredy Squirrel, all-time best. If you're into this talk at all on your way out, stop and look at this one, because this is a book that if any teacher or parent would read this and not talk about the print, you're robbing yourself of a great conversation with the child, because it has all these fantastic print features, lists of things the the squirrel is scared of out in the beyond. And so it's really ripe for those conversations.
I was wondering about the study where you had a condition where they talked about print and then there was sound or phonological awareness and then the control. So I was wondering why you put another condition in there that also is very evidence-based as important for learning to read, and then would be disappointed when that was high.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in designing a study where you're really trying to make causal claims, so you have your condition. We're going to have parents do this. And part of the fun of designing an intervention is having what we call the best comparative condition ever. And we call that the counterfactual. And if your counterfactual is perfectly equated, but with one little difference, and then you see the change happen, you feel like $1 million. And so what we actually thought is if you have parents talk about sound or phonological awareness and print knowledge are different constructs, and they're somewhat encapsulated from each other. So if parents talk about phonological awareness, it shouldn't impact kids' print. It shouldn't have that bleed over effect, theoretically. But it should have impacts on kids' phonological awareness. And so everything was a bit of a mess in that study. And I have a hunch why. And I think it's because when parents would implement a phonological awareness activity, so the parents, it would say something like, find what word on this page starts with the sound S. And the parents were to help their kids find, I can't exactly remember what it was. Parents almost always turned it into a print task. So what the parents would say, oh, we have to find a word that starts with the sound. That's an S, it's an S, let's find the S. So it actually turned into very explicit print instructions some of the time, and it kind of was a botched experiment. So if I could take the whole thing back, I would do it totally different. Yeah.
So I'm wondering how, or is there work that you or others are doing to kind of coach parents through these processes so they're not just doing the behaviors, but they're also having the right affect or sort of interactions with children? Like how, or in what ways might your research address that, or would it just be different research?
Boy, I can't think of anything that, I think somewhere, I don't think anybody really that I'm reading and that is really influential today is really talking about the affective aspect of it. Now, it comes up in some of the correlational work that people do. So they'll study, we've done this, study affective aspects of the interaction between parent and child and look at its association with other things. But I can't think of anyone who's really doing it well in intervention. So if you're looking for a project, that would be a good one.
Hi, I just had one question. I noticed that in one of the earlier studies you had the English and Spanish in the bottom and for the zoo book, and then you had the little study with Oscar and the cute little picture of all the family. And I was wondering what kind of strategies were used in bilingual situations or in with children who are English language learners?
So the work I do in Mexico is actually in a monolingual situation where it's totally Spanish and I don't speak a lick of Spanish. So I always work with a translator and we work with families in their homes. So that's not a bilingual situation. And I do work now with ELLs, but only through my friends who are real scholars in that area. And so I work with some folks at Arizona State and they're designing early literacy interventions and they have the expertise that I don't. So,
when you were talking about the No Child Left Behind, I wanted to know if you ended up finding teachers teaching to the law and ignoring the cognitive stages that the children were in, just kind of surpassing that and being bound to that law?
So most of the 2001 No Child Left Behind really focused on the primary grades. And what you're saying is a real concern, and it has been for the last decade, of what particularly the mandated testing has done in the classroom. I have really stuck it stuck my career in the preschool classroom. So I haven't had to experience those concerns on the front line. I think there's other policies that have impacted the preschool sector, but not No Child Left Behind in that way.
Okay. Thank you.
I want to thank Laura very much. Let's give her another big round of applause.